Good morning, guys, and welcome to the podcast. And what if I had a founder of a nonprofit helping people restart their lives and also an award winning author and former journalist? Today, I have just a guest, John David Graham. He's got a fantastic story and experience talking with people with different perspectives, and he runs a nonprofit. And we're going to examine what the nonprofit does and all of the learnings and experiences and all of his insights to add value to the audience. So, John, welcome.
I'm very glad to be here, Chris. Thank you.
Yeah. Briefly introduce yourself, and I'm excited to dive into the questions for the audience.
I think the best way is to say that I've been homeless. At one point, I've gone through 7, 8 career changes. And at 53, when most people should be talking about retiring, I started Good Samaritan Home to help people who were struggling more than me. And in the past 23 years, we've grown from just a bedroom in our own house to 19 separate houses and a staff of 10 and a budget of pushing $2 million a year. So I understand what it takes to try and fail and try again. Because at 75, I published my debut novel after 200 rejections.
Oh, wow.
And it was about second chances, which was actually not my life story, but I certainly lived it. I think I'm a pretty well-versed person on how to do 2 and 3 and 4 times over and over again, as long as we keep trying.
Right. Yeah, that's a wonderful segue into the conversation. And one thing, I talk to the common people, and usually they're just, I've had guests on the show talk about just mediocrity or just go being mainstream. And then I have guests such as yourself, extraordinary, doing extraordinary things. And some of the common threads are just like these. Sometimes it's tragedy, sometimes it's just the depths of despair. Talk about 7 or 8 career changes, all these things. What do you think people to your levels of success have to go through all of that? And what are your learnings and revelations?
The thing I've found is, at least in my own life, and I'm learning in the lives of many people, is that some of us come from a background where we weren't given the tools. So we didn't have the structure. We didn't have the ability to know how to get through hard times or even how to get through normal times. And we made mistakes, impulse decision making, or the lack of stick-to-itiveness. And so I would, and also to make matters worse, I grew up in the 60s and they were extraordinarily unstable, politically, sociologically, psychologically. In fact, they say if you remember the 60s, you didn't live through them. It reminded me, 1968 reminds me a great deal of the politics of today, because we're again going through a very unstable period. So I think our work now is very pertinent, helping people find their place where they can actually be what I call normal, if there is such a thing. But I tried multiple careers, end up moving from state to state. I was a children's home counselor. I was a truck driver. I was a fireman. I was a journalist, a building contractor. I moved from Michigan to Kentucky to Texas, trying to follow the trades. And eventually I ended up as a journalist, and even I did a stint as a minister thinking I could teach. And I found that I'm not so good at many of those things because I didn't have the background or the structure. And that's when we decided to start Good Samaritan Home, because I wanted to help people who were in the same situation as I was, or even more so. So Good Samaritan Home is primarily a shelter, but it's a mentoring home. And out of that, the Department of Corrections said, can you help us with people coming from prison who they've done their bit in prison, they paid their price, but now they need some degree of stability. And we offered our own bedroom to do that initially. And to be quite candid, there was no salary for the first 5 years. It was all investment. And my wife and I lived off of her salary as a McDonald's employee. But we found that over time, and the question we addressed is, what is the need in the community? And by answering that question, by adapting to that question, we grew according to the need. one house, two house, three houses, and our contract with the state of Ohio increased our per diem contract. So they would compensate us while we house somebody. So we don't charge our residents, but the state would pay us because it's cheaper to have somebody in our housing program than it is to be in jail.
Uh-huh.
So everybody wins.
Yeah.
So now I've had, like I said, I have 10 staff, and the object is transferring the understanding of how we deal with broken people.
Uh,
And it's taken 23 years, but my staff, I think, has really gotten that message.
yeah. Interesting. And one question, because I actually had another guest on the podcast, and he wrote a book about helping people incarcerated afterwards and the lessons he learned. What is it about the incarcerated population that caused you to what is it about? I'm just curious because I had the other guest was also helping those as well.
Well, I want to be careful. It's very easy, particularly in the faith community or in the helping community, to think of if you just go out and just give somebody a fish, help somebody, feed somebody for the day. But you have to be wise. In the Bible, we say wise as serpents, but as gentle as doves,
Uh,
because there's a reason why people are homeless and the reason why they're in jail. And
uh,
almost always, about 80% of the time, it's either addictions or it's mental health issues.
yeah,
And I put mental health a large factor there.
yeah,
So I would not recommend everybody do what we do. And that's why we build in safeguards. But I will say this, Chris, that when a fella says to me after being in prison for 10 years or 20 years, and he says, this is the cleanest house, or this is the safest house, or better yet, this is the only place I've ever been in that I could call home.
yeah,
That to me says volumes. And when a guy gets a job, and for the first time in his life, he holds up a certificate that says, you've been promoted to shift manager. And he's so proud of that. I think when you deal with people who have nothing,
uh,
they're grateful for just even the little bit. And and these are people who've been through 10 times more than I've been through.
hmm, interesting. Yeah, it's again, I had also another guest. These days, I'm talking to business entrepreneurs and just people doing amazing things. And he was saying the same thing. He had been through tragedy. And once you start looking around, you realize you're not as bad as you think you are. One thing, so we'll talk about just this nonprofit and second chances. And one thing is talking about because you wrote a novel or running as fast as I can. It's got numerous awards. What inspired you to write this story, and how much of it is drawn from your own experiences?
I would say the rough outline, very rough outline comes from my life, but it's drawing on people that I know. So it's not an autobiographical book, but it's obviously you write from your own experience, particularly your own feelings. But what happened was when we started Good Samaritan Home, we thought that the community would say, that's a good thing. We welcome you. But the truth is, there was a lot of blowback. And there were petitions, there were calls to the council, there were meetings before the city council, there were threats. I had police protection at some meetings. There was, at one point, it was so intense that somebody tried to stab me in front of the courthouse
Wow.
because people have an instinctual fear of anything that's other than us. And what happened was they thought that we were bringing in outsiders, but the truth is that we were actually helping local people that nobody was willing to talk about, particularly with the drug epidemic.
Oh,
With meth and then heroin became prevalent in the rural communities as well as the big cities. So we started dealing a great deal with people who were in the local jail who were coming out homeless. So instead of helping those people, it turned out to be it was your son or your daughter, or it might have been your brother or sister. And that made it more personal.
yeah.
But what happened, Chris, was I tried to explain to people and I give them data. And I could do that here and talk about recidivism and how we can actually save money. But nobody listens to data. So what I realized was that uh, I compare it to the Titanic. If I wanted to talk about lifeboat safety, nobody would go to that movie. But if I put Jack and Rose on the Titanic and made it into a romance, suddenly everybody is thinking about lifeboat safety. And that's what running as fast as I can is. It's a story of Daniel Robinson coming from an abusive family, a dysfunctional family, and he spends his life trying to create a new family, and he fails again and again. And it's a story of second, third, fourth chances. And all along, he meets these broken people that he forms into part of his family. So I like to call it Titanic on dry land.
Interesting. Yeah. It's very powerful, this power of storytelling and an effective tool for inspiring change and fostering empathy. A follow-up question lessons from a varied career as well as advice for reinvention. And you've had a incredibly diverse career path. And what do you think the universe or life brought these experiences and shape your perspective on life, resilience, and success?
Right. In this day and age, particularly at the internet, we write things in ink. If you make a mistake, if you say the wrong thing, it's out there forever. And God forbid you put a picture of yourself that you shouldn't. And you can never live that down. And in small ways, we do that in our communities where we say, I remember you in high school, or I remember what my friend said about you. And even legitimate mistakes, we're forever wearing those. And I think everybody is looking for a second chance.
Mm,
And that's resonated with people
mm.
because I know I've needed it. There are times I'm still embarrassed when I meet somebody and I think what I did to them or said to them 20 years ago.
Wow.
And I've never been incarcerated. So you can imagine if you had committed a felony, how much you feel like you're always living that, even though you paid your dues in jail.
Mm.
You feel emotionally like you can never be normal. And that's what Daniel's story is about. It's this idea of we do get second and third chances. In fact, the theme coming through the book again and again is life is written in pencil. We
Yeah.
do get a lot of do-overs.
Wow.
And,
It's,
and that's what readers have picked up. It's garnered 26 awards so far. And it all comes down to this idea that readers can identify with Daniel and they can identify with that second chance and excitement of starting over.
uh-huh. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. And I feel like we're socially conditioned. And again, we talk about like the media, and it's just portrayed as, I like to describe it as, it's like this Disney World fairy tale. It's supposed to have a happily ever after ending, and it's like you start your car and you just drive, and then you end up at the end, and there's no twists or turns. But which is a lot of people before your hand was talking about, people had to suffer setbacks and go through all these things. One thing, because what was really interesting is we're living in very interesting times, and I started to notice like the world changing in 2000, and it's totally different 24 years later. And we're having so many issues. How do you think 2024 compares to the 60s? I'm just trying to get some wisdom and experience.
The 1968 is considered to be a cataclysmic year
Yeah.
because it seemed like everything pivoted there. And I was what I call mainstream. I was going to a small Methodist college, so it was removed from all the protests, but
Uh-huh.
we still felt this great disrespect for authority. We felt like we couldn't. The Vietnam War was pervasive,
Mm.
and I had to live with the fact that I will be drafted as
Oh,
soon as I'm out of college, and I will be in Vietnam. And I had to wrestle with that for 4 years. And then when I graduated, I had to deal with that. And the whole world was coming apart over Vietnam. And then you add in Watergate, and we lost faith in the government structure itself. In fact, it took me 30 years to enter a voting booth after Watergate. And of course, then again, it's gotten so strange today that my biggest concern today is voter apathy that will come out of this latest round of elections. The feeling like my voice doesn't matter
uh,
and you feel like you can't trust. And I think that's what we're seeing again. Can I trust elected people? Are they really speaking for me? Do
uh,
they hear my voice? And my research is showing that the greatest theme coming out of this election is that the working class feels like they're not heard.
Uh,
particularly men, and they're angry and they voted angry. And it reminds me, in that respect, it reminds me a great deal of the 68.
uh,
Instead of Vietnam, we're just mad as everything.
so it sounds like it's even worse than the 60s, is what I gather is from talking to you.
I would say so. Now we've forgotten about it, but we had campus bombings.
Oh, wow.
There were protests. They literally shut down Washington at one point. But I think the difference is today there is cynicism that the government itself doesn't work.
Uh-huh.
And no matter who you vote in, I think people feel that it won't make any difference. And indifference is, I think, the most dangerous thing
Uh-huh.
because indifference will lead to a strong leader going the wrong direction.
Uh-huh.
An authoritarian response that, and history is replete with those type of examples in Europe in 1920,
Uh-huh.
or we saw that in 1870 in Europe also, and then again we're seeing it resurging itself in the world now where there's a move towards authoritarianism. What I try to do, Chris, is I try to present a message of hope in my little world, but I think it applies to you and to others
Mhm.
that you can make a difference.
Mhm.
And it might be just in your town. And
Wow.
you're not going to go to Washington, you're not going to be president, but maybe you can help some one person, and maybe that may make a difference.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, I actually echo a lot of your sentiments that you were just describing, just how we'll go. But it's just this increasing distrust of government, and there's so much corruption and just waste and spending so much money on just these frivolous wars. And we have so many problems here we're not fixing, and politicians getting rich for themselves. And just it's because like you said, the system does not work. But the question is, what advice would you have or give to someone looking to reinvent themselves as they start over later in life, particularly after a major setback? How do you start?
I think as long as you're moving, it's when you stop moving, then nothing will change. Here, I'll give you a good example. I do my writing in San Antonio. So I was down there and I read something in the paper that they were looking for, some movie company was looking for walk-on actors. Now, I'm 76 years old. I'm not an actor. I'm not a pretty boy by any means. But I said, what the heck? So I put my name into it, sent my picture in, and they hired me to be an actor in a television show. It was with Harrison Ford and a thing called 1923. So I drove up to Austin, they fitted me out, and I got paid for my fitting room, even though my scene will likely be cut. The fact is that I tried something new. I stepped out of my comfort zone. And today, technically, I can call myself an actor. And that, I think, is a microcosm of what we're talking about, is that nothing will change unless you try something new. And it could be something so frivolous as doing a one-day gig as an actor where you just walk in down the street and that's 3 seconds of a career. It's not the industry, not the $32 they paid me. It's the fact that you do something to change your life for the better. Try something new.
Yeah,
So that's what I'd recommend is what is the need in the community and what can you do? And if it doesn't work, try something new.
yeah,
Try it again. I'm always looking for I call it a back door. There is another way somewhere.
yeah. Interesting. Yeah. How can people find out more about you? And because I love your approach, and then also learn more about your nonprofit and check out your book and reach out to you.
Well, the best way to do it is there's two ways. You can go to goodsamaritanhome.org. That's where the nonprofit is located. But also, my book author website is at johndavidgraham.com. And what I tell folks is that you can link onto the Amazon webpage for the book called Running as Fast as I Can. And it's not a how-to book. It's just a story about what I call everyman, just a young kid who struggles all of his life to overcome his past. And we can learn the lessons from that. And the best part is you can download 2 or 3 free chapters and take a look at it for no cost at all.
Yeah, I love that.
But I would recommend people look at, and you can contact me through the website. I'd be glad to field any questions someone has.
Yeah. I always love to ask this because when I have guests that have such a beautiful library, and for the audience that are listening this on audio, you can check out the video podcast in the links in the show notes. But what is like your most impactful book that you've read or that you could recommend to the audience?
Interesting. I would say the most impactful is a book I read in 10th grade. We were supposed to read Julius Caesar. 10th graders reading Shakespeare. That didn't go over well. So we had a young intern teacher who said, "Would you like to read a book called Of Human Bondage?" And of course, we all raised our hands. We had no idea what it was, but it sounded really crazy.
Uh-huh.
And it turns out it's a classic English novel by Somerset Maugham about a boy who grows up with a club foot, and it's not his foot that's really damaged, it's his self-image.
Uh-huh.
And he spends his life struggling and in bad relationships because he never can see himself as normal.
Oh.
And that became the model, not just for my life, but it became the model for my book. And this idea that we're all broken by birth or by circumstance,
Uh-huh.
and how we deal with that brokenness is what makes the difference.
Interesting. Wow. Yeah, it reminds me of a book, Psycho-Cybernetics. It was about
I've read it. I read it.
yeah. Let's see.
Yeah, I read that when I was in college. It was a
Uh,
great self-image psychology book.
yeah. It's so fascinating. I'll have to check out the book and put the links in the show notes. And thanks so much. And keep up the great work. And I really love your approach and your philosophy. And thanks so much for coming on.
I'm glad to talk to you, Chris. Thank you, brother. Appreciate it.
Uh,